In the long, gilded scroll of British royal history, few endings are as grotesque, as pitiful, or as drenched in tragedy as that of King George IV. His death, on a pale morning in June 1830, was not the peaceful passing of a sovereign surrounded by dignity and devotion. It was something else entirely, the slow collapse of a man who had once stood at the very center of power and beauty, now reduced to something that barely resembled a human being at all. They called him, in his prime, the first gentleman of England, a prince of glittering charm, a fashion icon, a patron of the arts, a man whose silhouette was once the very outline of elegance itself. But by the end, that silhouette had swollen and blurred into a hulking mass of flesh. Twisted by disease and drowned in excess, even his own servants, the men and women paid to show deference, recoiled at the sight. And worse, the smell. This is not merely a story about the death of a king. It is the unraveling of a life. The slow, nightmarish descent of a man consumed by privilege, indulgence, and fear. What follows is a tale best told in hushed tones, not out of reverence, but because it feels like opening the door to a crypt. And in that crypt lies not just a corpse, but a cautionary tale. Tonight, we begin not with a crown, but with a boy, handsome, brilliant, born to rule, and trace the shadow that grew behind him, one indulgence at a time. This is the story of George Augustus Frederick, Prince of Wales, Regent, and King, the man who dined like a Caesar, ruled like a ghost, and died like a forgotten emperor in a forgotten wing of Windsor Castle. George Augustus Frederick was born on August 12, 1762, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. From the very beginning, the young prince stood apart. He was intelligent, articulate, and almost unnervingly handsome. Courtiers whispered that he had the looks of a hero from a romantic painting and the charm to match. By the time he was a teenager, he had become the darling of fashionable society. London adored him, but behind the gold-framed portraits and flattering poems, something darker stirred. George was restless, deeply so. His father, King George III, ruled with restraint and religious conviction. The court was austere, cold, and bound in strict moral codes. For a boy born into unimaginable privilege but shackled by expectation, it was a suffocating world. By the time he turned 21, George had set up residence at Carlton House on London's Pall Mall. It was there that he began what can only be described as a deliberate, almost artful act of self-destruction. While his father praised moderation and simplicity, George embraced the opposite. He surrounded himself with gamblers, drunkards, and charming rogues. He drank to excess, spent without care, and indulged in affairs that filled the gossip pages of every newspaper in England. Some said he was simply young, others warned that he was already too far gone. His mornings began with brandy. His nights ended in a fog of wine and perfume. A typical breakfast, if such a word applies, might include 2 pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, several glasses of champagne and port, and a glass of brandy to finish. It was more feast than meal, more ceremony than sustenance. And through it all, the prince admired himself in the mirror. His vanity was not just a trait, it was a way of life. His tailors worked like engineers, crafting garments to enhance his physique. He wore high collars to frame his jawline, silk to reflect candlelight just right, and cologne so potent it lingered after he left a room. But as the years passed, the mirror began to reflect things George preferred not to see. His face softened, his chin doubled, his waist thickened, and yet, the self-admiration never ceased. He demanded tighter corsets, richer fabrics, and portraits that flattered rather than recorded. In public, he was still the prince of style. In private, the cracks had already begun to show. It was around this time that George fell in love, or something like it, with Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow whose marriage to him was not only scandalous but illegal under British law. The union created a constitutional crisis. But George, as always, wanted what he wanted. Law, duty, and consequence were things for other people. It would not be his last scandal. As London watched, amused and appalled in equal measure, the Golden Prince of England began a slow transformation, not sudden, not violent, but steady and constant, like wine turning to vinegar. It happened quietly. The man who had once captivated a kingdom was becoming something else. Not yet grotesque, not yet broken, but the fall had begun. In 1810, the madness of King George III became permanent. His mind, already fragile, finally shattered beyond repair. He would live for another decade, locked away in Windsor Castle, blind and broken, unaware of the world beyond his windows. In his place, the government appointed his eldest son as Prince Regent, the acting king in all but name. To many, this moment should have marked George's redemption. Here, at last, was his chance to prove himself not just a man of taste and elegance, but of substance and leadership. For a brief moment, even his harshest critics dared to hope. They were wrong. The Regency years, from 1811 to 1820, were not an era of responsible governance. They were a masquerade, glittering, extravagant, and hollow. George now had the full weight of royal power at his disposal. And he wielded it not to serve his people, but to serve himself. He spent without restraint. Lavish architectural projects turned London into a jewel box of neoclassical beauty, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, Regent Street, and the palatial expansions of Buckingham House. These buildings remain today as monuments to his aesthetic vision, but behind their facades lay debts that swallowed whole fortunes. He patronized the arts like a Medici, acquiring priceless paintings and surrounding himself with composers, poets, and sculptors. Yet while culture blossomed in his shadow, so did his own ruin. The Prince Regent's appetite, already infamous, grew monstrous. He drank like a man with something to forget. His dinners became theatrical performances of consumption. At Carlton House, meat was delivered by the ton. Wines flowed in rivers. It was said that the prince could eat for hours, then slump, sweating and dazed, into a stupor, only to wake and begin again. He was no longer the slender, dashing figure once painted by Gainsborough. By the age of 40, he weighed over 270 pounds, a mountain of brocade, corsets, and flesh. His face, once described as Grecian, had bloated beyond recognition. His chin had become chins. His waistline expanded so far that his corsets, reinforced with steel and whalebone, left bruises along his ribs. But vanity knows no limits. George continued to demand that his tailors design garments that flattered an illusion rather than a reality. His wigs became taller, his colors louder, his postures more exaggerated. He applied powders and rouge to skin now gray with illness, attempting to restore a youth long since lost. He wore silver robes and peacock blue jackets, hoping that splendor could still dazzle the eye and hide the truth. In public, he posed. In private, he collapsed. Behind closed doors, the prince became increasingly dependent on laudanum, a liquid opiate that dulled his pain but also clouded his mind. There were days when he disappeared into his chambers, unreachable and unaware, lost in a haze of dreams and drugs. His doctors, fearing the worst, began to dilute his doses. He would notice, and demand more. His marriage to Princess Caroline, already a public disaster, had become a cold war of insults and legal threats. He despised her. She, in turn, mocked him openly. When she described her husband to friends, she did not use royal titles. She used the word creature. And so, as Britain entered the industrial age, an era of steam and struggle, invention and upheaval, its de facto ruler was a man who could barely walk up a staircase without help. A man so deeply consumed by his own pleasures and pain that the affairs of state became afterthoughts, distractions from dinner, from wine, from despair. The Prince Regent had been given a kingdom, but what he truly ruled was a banquet table. On January 29, 1820, King George III died, blind and mad in his silent corner of Windsor Castle. He passed away unaware that his son, the man who had ruled in his name for a decade, would now take the throne in truth. And so George, Prince of Wales, became George IV, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Emperor in all but name. A coronation was planned, and George intended it to be the most spectacular Britain had ever seen. It was. The ceremony cost nearly £1 million, a staggering fortune in its day. The new king wore robes of silver tissue so grand, so heavy, that attendants had to help him walk. Upon his head rested a crown decorated with over 12,000 hired diamonds. Every corner of Westminster Abbey glittered with theatrical excess. There were silk banners, golden scepters, and music composed just for the occasion. But beneath the spectacle, something had shifted. The crowd outside did not cheer as they once had. Many muttered that the king looked like a monstrous whale dressed for the stage. And within the abbey, something was missing. Queen Caroline. George had refused to allow her entry. Guards blocked the doors. She banged and shouted, demanding her rightful place beside him. But the king had banished her, not only from his presence, but from his story. It was a decision that shocked the nation, not because it was cruel, but because it was public. The whole of England saw it, and many did not forgive. That day, the mask began to slip. In the months that followed, George's popularity, already fragile, disintegrated. His efforts to divorce Caroline in Parliament backfired, igniting public sympathy for the wronged queen. Crowds jeered the king in the streets. Satirical prints portrayed him as bloated and ridiculous, a caricature of monarchy. Where once people had laughed behind fans, now they laughed openly. But George did not change course. He retreated further into his private world, where food, drink, and illusion ruled. He had his meals served on golden platters, even as his teeth rotted. He drank spirits from goblets fit for emperors, even as his hands shook from illness. He insisted on playing the part of the monarch, lavishly dressed, elaborately posed, even as his own body betrayed him at every turn. By 1824, his weight had surpassed 280 pounds. His legs, swollen from fluid and gout, ached so badly that stairs became impossible. Servants were forced to carry him from room to room like a living statue. He could no longer dress himself. He could barely stand, and yet he demanded mirrors. In every chamber, in every hall, reflections stared back at him, distorted, powdered, lit from behind to soften the truth. His tailors fashioned suits to fit not a man, but a monument. His wigs grew taller, his colognes grew stronger. What they could not hide was the smell. The king's skin, stretched tight and rarely cleaned, developed sores that festered in the folds of his flesh. His servants whispered that touching him felt like pressing raw dough. Visitors learned to breathe through their mouths. Some fled his chambers gagging. Queen Adelaide, wife of his brother William, quietly moved to another wing of Windsor Castle just to escape the odor. Still, George dined. His appetite, untouched by age or illness, remained enormous. Though he could no longer taste properly, dulled by medication and decay, he demanded rich, spiced dishes in absurd quantities. He would eat until his breathing failed, then rest, then eat again. Those who witnessed these meals spoke of them not with admiration, but with pity or horror. Behind closed doors, the king was disintegrating, and yet, the court still bowed, the ministers still nodded, the portrait artists still painted what was no longer there. For the time being, the crown still shone, but the man beneath it had begun to vanish. By the mid-1820s, King George IV no longer ruled in any meaningful sense. He signed no laws. He read no reports. He gave no useful advice. Ministers had learned to govern around him, crafting a monarchy that functioned in his absence. What the nation saw was a flickering shadow of a sovereign, a man too sick to lead, too proud to step aside. Inside Windsor Castle, the king's world had shrunk to a few dim corridors and overheated chambers. The once vibrant prince, once the center of every ballroom and salon, now lived like a ghost in his own palace, wheeled from room to room by servants who winced at the weight, who whispered about the stench, and who avoided his eyes. George's body had become a burden too great for him to bear. His legs were swollen with fluid, his joints burned with gout, his stomach bulged outward, pressing against corsets that could no longer contain it. Simply sitting upright required cushions, straps, and servants on both sides. He could no longer lie down. If he tried, the weight of his own chest crushed his lungs. So he slept in a custom-built chair, propped upright, head tilted, mouth half open, breathing in desperate, rattling gasps. Night after night, his chambers echoed with wheezing and groans, punctuated by the sharp clink of a spoon stirring laudanum. That sound, spoon, glass, swallow, became the rhythm of his nights. The king had become addicted, entirely and utterly, to opium. He took it in drops, then spoonfuls, then more. It dulled the pain, blurred the shame, and kept the darkest thoughts at bay. But the haze came at a price. He grew paranoid, suspicious. He believed his servants mocked him behind his back, and often they did. One moment he would rage, red-faced and trembling, shouting nonsense. The next, he would weep like a child. He was impossible to reason with, and unbearable to serve. Only the most loyal, or desperate, remained. Mirrors were removed from his rooms. Not for vanity, but for mercy. The king could no longer face his reflection. He avoided windows during the day and ordered heavy curtains drawn shut. Light, once his ally in showing off satin and jewels, now revealed too much, and so the chambers stayed dim, heavy with perfume, sweat, and silence. His handwriting, once elegant, had vanished. His fingers were too swollen to hold a pen. Parliament created a stamp of his signature so the documents could still carry his name, though he rarely understood what he was signing. His eyesight failed, leaving him nearly blind. His teeth blackened and fell out. His skin, stretched and neglected, split in places and wept fluid. The sores refused to heal. Servants dabbed them with cloth, trying to keep the smell from worsening. But it did. The king no longer smelled like a man. He smelled like death. Visitors to the castle would note the odor from several rooms away, a pungent mix of unwashed flesh, medicine, decay, and infection. It seeped into tapestries, rugs, and even the wood of his furniture. There were whispers that Windsor Castle would never lose the scent, even after he was gone. Still, George demanded his meals. Each day, multiple courses were served: meats, sauces, wines, sweets. He would eat with mechanical determination, even when gasping for air between bites. Food was no longer pleasure. It was ritual, the only thing left that he could still command. His longtime mistress, Lady Conyngham, began to withdraw. His friends stopped visiting. Even his dogs, once loyal companions, were sent away due to the smell. And yet he lived on. Doctors were summoned daily. They listened to his heart. They examined his skin. They recommended rest, which he already had, less food, which he ignored, less drink, which he defied. One doctor described the king's body as a ticking machine of failure, every organ damaged, every system exhausted. But still, he woke up each morning. He feared death more than anything. He begged his physicians to keep him alive, even for a few more days. He confessed his sins to priests in vivid, uncomfortable detail, not seeking forgiveness, but reassurance. He asked if God would really judge him harshly. He asked if heaven could still be promised to a man like him. And then, he would pour another glass of brandy. The palace staff began to speak of him as if he were already gone. The king was not dying, he was decaying. They no longer bowed in full. They no longer whispered in reverence. He had become a thing to be managed, not served, a grotesque presence, breathing, but no longer truly alive. And all across Britain, people waited. They waited for the bells to toll. They waited for the news. They waited for the king to die. By the summer of 1830, even George IV's doctors had stopped pretending. The king was dying. His heart, swollen with fat and struggling against decades of abuse, now beat like a tired drum, irregular, weak, and barely able to move blood through his enormous body. His lungs wheezed and collapsed under the pressure of his own weight. His digestive system had all but shut down. His liver was failing. His kidneys barely functioned. Each morning was a surprise. Each night was a vigil. The servants no longer asked if he would die. They asked when. On the night of June 25th, a strange calm settled over Windsor Castle. George sat in his usual position, upright, strapped into his chair, breathing in shallow gasps, a silk cloth wrapped around his neck to catch the constant stream of fluid from his mouth. He dismissed his physicians with a faint wave, insisting that he felt better, but those who saw him that evening knew otherwise. His skin had taken on a greyish tone. His eyes were glassy, and his words, though few, came slurred. Only one man remained at his side that night, Sir William Waller, his ophthalmologist and, perhaps, his last companion who stayed out of care rather than duty. The night wore on. George dozed and stirred, muttered and gasped. At one point, he clutched Waller's hand and whispered, "Fetch Sir Henry, this is death." A little after 3 a.m., his body began to convulse. There was blood, a final, violent failure of the bowel, the end of a system pushed far beyond its limit. His breathing grew erratic, his eyes fluttered, and for one brief moment, he opened his mouth as if to speak. Some claimed his last words were, "Good God, what is this?" Others remembered only a low groan. At 3:15 in the morning, King George IV died. His head tilted forward, his eyes closed. The hand that had once signed royal decrees and lifted golden goblets now hung limp and bloated at his side. He was 67 years old. The news spread fast, but the reaction was quiet, not solemn, but strangely empty. There was no national mourning in the traditional sense. The Times, Britain's most respected newspaper, offered perhaps the most brutal obituary ever written for a monarch. One line captured the mood of a nation. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. It was not grief, it was relief. The practical matter of burying the king proved as difficult as managing him in life. His coffin, made of Spanish mahogany and lined with lead, had to be reinforced to hold his weight. The floor beneath the royal vault was strengthened with iron braces. The corridors of Windsor were lined with wooden panels to prevent damage from the casket's bulk. Even in death, he was heavy. The undertakers wore cloth over their faces to mask the smell. Despite embalming efforts, decay had already set in. It clung to the fabric, to the wood, and to memory. The lying in state drew crowds, but not mourners. Many came simply to see if it was true that the bloated, decaying figure who once wore 12,000 diamonds was really gone. Some laughed, others whispered jokes. There were few tears. At the funeral, protocol demanded silence. Black dress, bowed heads, but what filled the chapel was not sorrow, but fidgeting, coughing, and the creak of wooden pews. Courtiers told stories and made small talk. Even George's brother, William, now King William IV, seemed more eager than sad. The casket was lowered with difficulty. Pulleys groaned, ropes strained. The vault accepted him like a mouth closing over the end of something that had already been gone for years. There were no touching eulogies, no whispered tributes. The man who had once captivated Europe, who had worn beauty like armor, who had eaten like a god, dressed like a prince, and ruled like a ghost, was buried beneath stone and silence. He left behind no heirs of note, no great victories, no lasting love. What he left was a lesson, one that echoed quietly through the cold halls of Windsor, long after the smell had faded and the laughter had died down. Even kings must answer to time. And sometimes, time is cruel. The body of George IV now rests beneath the stone floor of St. George's Chapel, surrounded by other kings and queens, names carved in Latin, dusted in silence. But George left behind more than a tomb. He left a question: how does a man born to rule end up so utterly unloved? His reign, officially spanning just 10 years, produced little of lasting value in governance. There were no wars he led, no reforms he championed, no causes he made his own. Parliament learned to operate in his absence. Ministers ruled, the people worked, and the monarch, bloated and drugged, drifted further from relevance with each passing year. And yet, he changed Britain, though not in the way he might have hoped. He became a warning, a living reminder that privilege without restraint becomes rot. That beauty, left unchecked, curdles into vanity. That power, when used only to indulge the self, devours the very person who holds it. To his admirers, and there were a few, George IV was a patron of art and architecture. He helped shape the face of modern London, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, the reconstruction of Windsor Castle, the elegance of Regent Street, all bear his influence. He loved music, painting, poetry. In another life, perhaps, he could have been remembered as a cultural prince. But history rarely deals in perhaps. The scale of his excess overwhelmed the shape of his achievements. His taste may have been refined, but his appetite was not. His elegance was expensive. His parties were legendary not for their brilliance, but for their waste. And in the end, his body became the truest metaphor for his reign, overdecorated, oversized, and collapsing under its own weight. Those who knew him left damning words. The Duke of Wellington, never prone to exaggeration, once said George was the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life, the most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, and the most entirely without one redeeming quality. A king, a son, a brother, a monarch, a man who had every advantage the world could offer, and who used them not to rise, but to fall. There are no statues to George IV that inspire reverence. No children bear his name in admiration. No historians find in him a secret virtue, long overlooked. What remains are the jokes, the gossip, the paintings touched up to hide the truth, What remains is a reign that cost more than it gave. And yet, there is something strangely human in his story. He was terrified of aging. He clung to beauty. He longed to be admired. Even when he no longer recognized himself. He lied to others. Yes, but mostly to himself. He was not a tyrant. He was not a villain. He was a mirror, one that showed, in cruel detail, what happens when power meets weakness, when charm outlives purpose, and when indulgence is mistaken for happiness. Tonight, as you lie in bed and this story fades, remember not just the decay or the scandal. Remember the silence that followed his death, the emptiness that echoed through a palace once filled with laughter and music. That, too, is legacy. Not what is said, but what is not what is built, but what is left behind. George IV left behind a throne, tarnished, but intact, and a warning, quiet, but unforgettable.